My name is Matthew Kane, and this is the Dirty Air F1 podcast.
Oh, yellow where you are. Watch what they bring. Yeah.
I got sprayed with all kind of fucking shit. It's gonna be
Okay, Kimi, your safety car window is closed. Safety car, mode C, and work on your brakes and tires. And there is a lot of debris on the track.
I know, because it just happened fucking 50
I know. I know.
My car is full of shit.
Oh no, we are checking the tires.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm with you. Don't worry, we're checking.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Dirty Air F1 podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Kane. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this episode, we'll be discussing some of the news topics that were in F1 before the Imola Grand Prix. We'll also be talking about the Imola Grand Prix itself, as well as my take or my forensic analysis of the incident between George Russell and Valtteri Bottas. But first, if you'd like to follow me on social media, I would like that as well. I am the Dirty Air F1 podcast on YouTube and Instagram. My website is thedirtyairf1.com, and on Twitter, I'm at dirty_F1. I'll see you there. Speaking of Twitter, I'm almost up to 600 followers. Woohoo! Way to go, guys. And gals. I've definitely directed most of my attention to Twitter at the moment. I am a one-man show. I do plan on building up my Instagram platform as well as my YouTube platform. One step at a time. We're moving in the right direction here. But Twitter was great this week. I held a online poll as to who was responsible in the Bottas-Russell incident, and I thought that the results were quite surprising. So thank you to everybody who participated. It offered a lot of new perspectives and opinions that I took into account before forming my own opinion. I shouldn't say form my own opinion. I had an opinion. I just feel like I'm a little bit more educated, and I'm grateful that everybody participated. And I'm doing my best to provide almost like a forensic analysis of the incident, not only in the physical, but in the mental aspect of it. I've posted pictures of where the cars were, where the cars have been throughout the race, and I think there's a little bit more that goes into this than just defending P9. I think there was a lot to do with Valtteri's mental state of mind, but I will definitely get to that at the end. But first up, let's look at some of the news in F1 before Imola. It's been officially announced that there'll be a race next year in Miami. Well, I got a story about Miami. I like to call Miami the home of the $80 breakfast. I was in South Beach a few years ago, and I checked into a hotel and received a coupon for breakfast, $30 off. I must admit, I sat there scratching my head thinking, $30 off? I mean, are you going to serve me breakfast and give me 20 back? That wasn't the case. A friend and I sat down for breakfast, and each had 3 eggs, 2 pieces of toast, a couple of pieces of bacon, some orange juice, and a cup of coffee. And the bill was 82 American dollars. I can only imagine how much these tickets are going to cost. So congratulations to Miami for securing the race. I just don't think I'll be going anytime soon. Also in the news, it looks like Aston Martin are about to sue the FIA based on the changes this year. Aston Martin has predicted they've lost close to a second in overall pace due to the new regulations. And you know what? There's not too much sympathy for them in the pits. Most of the team owners and designers have kindly said, well, you know what? If you misread the rules or couldn't figure them out, that's your problem. But like I've said before in previous podcasts, Lawrence Stroll is not the kind of character who just rolls over and plays dead. It'll be interesting to see what comes of this. I don't know if it's going to lead to any rule changes that benefit Aston Martin. I'm sure they're probably just looking at a compromise at this point. Anything to salvage something from this season that so far is just not up to Lawrence Stroll's expectations. He has poured an enormous amount of resources into Aston Martin's resurgence in F1. Let's just stay tuned. We'll see how this works out for them. But, you know, look at last year. Mercedes came out with the DAS system, and immediately they were told that it would not be allowed the following year. So rule changes do occur. Whether they're effective immediately or not is not always the situation, but we'll see how it goes, and I'll keep you updated. All right, now it's time to dive into this weekend's F1 race at Imola. Place where unfortunately we lost 2 of the sport's greatest legends, Ayrton Senna and Gilles Villeneuve. Imola is an older track, and quite narrow in most parts. It's not really built for today's F1 cars, and we certainly saw that during the race, where the main passing opportunity was along the DRS straight. One would expect this race to be rather boring, with very little passing, etc. Thankfully, We got a little bit of inclement weather, and it spiced things up. Quick shout out to my friends on Twitter, RacecastWX, who accurately predicted the race forecast, and it certainly helped me informing my picks. I love this old circuit, and I think many people share that opinion with me, especially compared to the new Tilke designs. This circuit has character. I mean, it's fantastic looking at the scenery that surrounds the track, the history of the track. I'm certainly glad they're back at Imola despite some of the awful circumstances that have happened there in the past. And you know what? It provided some pretty good racing this time around. So let's dive right into qualifying. And then what I'll do is I'll take each driver's performance in qualifying and then roll it straight into their race performance. And I'll summarize the race for you. Qualifying in 20th place for AlphaTauri was Yuki Tsunoda. Tsunoda, it must be said, is developing into quite a character in F1. Based on new technologies and new access to these guys, we're actually getting to hear a lot more about what's going on in the car while they're driving. And Tsunoda certainly is rambunctious, let's say. It's certainly fair to say that Tsunoda has impressed early on so far in F1, but I think this weekend's a little bit of a blemish. Now, I normally give rookies a lot of space to grow and to learn and to develop, but right now, Tsunoda looks like he's really trying to prove something a little too quickly. His performance in qualifying was, well, incredibly detrimental to the team as he went backwards into the wall and tore half of the car off. I was actually quite surprised at the amount of damage that he incurred, considering I didn't think he was going that fast. Thankfully, he wasn't hurt. I thought he showed great skill, making his way up to 12th in the race, but still just outside the points. And as always, Dr. Helmut Marko didn't hesitate to throw a driver from the junior team under the bus. I must admit, I'm confused as how Dr. Helmut Marko helps anybody. There are rumors that Gerhard Berger is going to be taking over for him once he retires, and having met Gerhard, Helmut, it's time to go. It's time to go, my friend. I would rate Tsunoda's performance at 4 out of 10, because let's face it, the AlphaTauri is good enough to score points, and he didn't. Heck of a drive and heck of an effort, but it only resulted in P12. And I think that AlphaTauri and AlphaTauri fans will be looking for more from Yuki going forward. Qualifying in 19th position is everyone's favorite F1 rookie, Nakita Mazepin. I gotta say, I tuned into the F1 Free Practice 1 session on my F1 app. It started off with Mazepin spinning, and it ended with Mazepin spinning. Hence his new F1 nickname, Mazaspin. Now, I heard a lot of people predicting how many corners it would take for Mazepin to spin and crash out of the race. But you know what? I had a strange feeling he would finish this race. I didn't think he'd be fast, but I thought he'd finish, and he did. He once again had an issue in qualifying when he passed Giovinazzi right before the hot lap. Gio was not impressed, but then again, we hear that Haas gave him the team orders to go. And I just don't get who's running the Haas situation here, because you have two rookies who obviously are trying to find their footing in Formula One, regardless if you like Mazepin or not. There's a lot to learn, and it doesn't seem like Haas is really helping. After qualifying, he gave a nonchalant answer to the question, why did he do it with Giovinazzi? So, simply just pass the guy. A very Kimi-like answer, in my opinion. Due to Mazepin's circumstances before he even entered F1 and his behavior since he's been in F1, it was seen as something completely different. His race pace was abysmal compared to Mick's. Race deltas have him over 2 seconds a lap slower on average throughout the race. One must wonder how long he's going to last in F1, or how long his dad is going to continue to foot the bill for a driver that's performing this way. One thing is surely going to be tested. Sometimes they say bad press is still good press. Haas is getting a lot of press. One of their drivers is the son of a famous Formula One legend, and you know what? To this point, is actually performing very, very well. And the other driver isn't. And all the attention is on Haas. Yet for the wrong reasons. Luckily for them, a few more off-track excursions didn't damage the car, and he brought it back and finished in P17. Almost a minute behind his teammate, Mick Schumacher. I rate Mazepin's performance on the weekend as a 3 out of 10. And that's only because he's a rookie and there were incredibly difficult driving conditions. Yet his behavior and attitude seem to be a little bit out of line for somebody who's trying to make a name for himself in the sport. Got to get better, Nakita. I know it's tough right now, but you got to get better. Qualifying in 18th position was Mick Schumacher. Mick has continued to impress everyone with his attitude and driving during his debut F1 season, completely unlike his teammate. Now, yes, Mick did make a pretty big mistake during the race, but again, he's a rookie with a good attitude and a lot of talent, and he's going about things the right way, so he gets a little bit of slack here. He overcooked the rear tires trying to heat them up before the restart, lost control of the car and crashed into the wall just past the pit exit. His front wing was completely obliterated, and unfortunately the pits were closed at the time, and he was forced to drive around for 2 laps with no front wing on. I was truly impressed with Mick's race engineer, Greg Gannon, who talked him through it. And you know what? I think they're a really good team. He's got a great race engineer, especially being a rookie. This is the kind of guy that you want in your ear during these difficult, high-pressure times. Mick ended up finishing a minute ahead of his teammate, kept the car on the track for the most part, and learned a lot of lessons. Difficult driving conditions expose people who don't have the talent, or certainly expose cars that don't have any grip. And Mick proved this weekend that he has a lot of talent. Now, he did finish 2 laps down, but I think that's far more the car than him, and he ended up finishing 16th. I would give Mick a rating of, I'm going to give him 7 out of 10. 7 out of 10. He gets a little bit of a rookie bonus. Well done, kid. Qualifying in 17th position was Antonio Giovinazzi. Giovinazzi is one of the drivers that I had on my 2021 hot seat, and he's still on it. Alfa Romeo didn't show the same kind of pace that it showed in Bahrain, especially in the dry during qualifying at Imola. They certainly didn't have the pace of Williams. And I hope that this trend continues where one type of circuit seems to favor one of those cars, and then they travel to a different type of circuit and it favors the other. Nothing like having a great battle at the back of the grid as well. Giovinazzi's final qualifying session definitely was hampered by Mazepin, and during the race, he had some debris going to his brakes. I'm not too sure what it was. I'm assuming it might have been a visor tear-off, but it did add 30 seconds to his time. But other than that, Giovinazzi was invisible, and he's been invisible this season. And he's being beaten again by Kimi Raikkonen. He ended up finishing in 14th position, only besting Laitffi, who crashed, Russell and Bottas, who crashed, Mazepin and Schumacher, who were 2 laps down, and Seb, who started the race with his brakes on fire. This doesn't sound like the type of guy that is in line for the next Ferrari availability. He definitely needs to improve his pace, and he needs to close the gap to Kimi Raikkonen. I would give Giovinazzi a rating of 4 out of 10. And I would say that needs to improve quickly if he wants to remain in Formula One. Qualifying in 16th position was the Iceman, Kimi Raikkonen. Not the best of qualifying sessions for Kimi. That's okay. Like I said before with Antonio, the Alfa Romeo didn't have any pace around Imola in the dry. Thankfully for Kimi, we had a wet race, and he got off to a fantastic start. It's these adverse conditions that help us see who the truly great drivers are on the grid. And Kimi, being a former Formula One world champion, certainly proved his mettle. It was Kimi who was behind Russell and Bottas when they came together. Both he and George were gaining on Bottas at the time. And had Russell gotten by Bottas cleanly, I honestly believe Kimi would have gotten him the very next lap. Kimi managed to find himself in 9th place. But a few hours after the race, all of his hard work was undone when he was assessed a 30-second time penalty. He was another victim on the day where it seemed like instances behind safety cars or restarts where people were having issues with traction and losing actual track position, causing quite a bit of confusion whether or not they were allowed to rejoin back in their previous position. As it stood, Kimi got it wrong, he got the penalty, and he finished just ahead of Giovinazzi. Despite the penalty and loss of points, I still rate Kimi's performance during the race quite highly. I give Kimi 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in 15th position was Fernando Alonso. This now evens the qualifying between himself and Ocon at 1 apiece. I thought Alpine on the whole had a bit of a nothing race. I know they scored points and that sounds odd, but again, this is not where I expected this team to be based on their performance near the end of last season. This is not where I expected Fernando Alonso to be, but he kept his head in difficult conditions, and it was nice to see him battling with Seb, even though Seb got the upper hand. Both the Alpine boys were the biggest benefactors of Kimi's penalty, and Alonso ended up finishing in 10th. I know there was mention that Alpine will be adding some upgrades to the car in the near future, and I hope so for both Fernando's sake and Ocon's. Both of these guys are too good to be lingering at the back of the pack. I want to see Alonso up front. I want to see how good Ocon is. Come on, Alpine, let's go. Alonso finishing P10 meant he got the last points paying position for the team, and I would rate his weekend as a 6 out of 10. Qualifying in 14th place was Nicholas Latifi. I think by far this was Latifi's best performance as a Formula One driver on the whole. He was fantastic during practice and excellent in qualifying, and it was great to see him closing the gap to George on raw pace. It's like I mentioned in a previous podcast, Latifi's one of those guys who improves. It's slow, it's steady, but he improves, and I like how he goes about his business. And you know what? He was having a fantastic week and on the whole, looked like he was potentially going to score some points for Williams. That was until race day. Unfortunately, he lost it and went off track, and when he rejoined, he didn't see Mazepin. He ended up in the wall, and that was the end of his race. Now, I admit, where Mazepin was, this is basically the worst spot somebody can be when you're trying to look for them in your mirrors. The F1 cars are not easy to see out of, especially in that area. I don't know if he didn't see Mazepin, or also, think about all the spray that was being kicked up at the beginning of the race when the track was super wet. That could have been an issue as well, possibly with his visor. But he did say after the race, he didn't even know he hit Mazepin. Thankfully, he was uninjured in the crash, but this was a lost opportunity for Williams, and a lost opportunity for Latifi. But I still think there are a lot of positives going forward for him. And you know what? Despite the crash on lap 1, I'm still giving Latifi a 6 out of 10. Qualifying in 13th place was Sebastian Vettel. This now makes it 2-0 in favor of Lance Stroll in qualifying. What do you make of that? Who would have predicted that before the season started? I know Seb he really hasn't had time to get used to the car, but it looked like they've made a number of adjustments for him, and he looked like he was getting a lot more on top of it. But there's just something about this rain cloud that's following him around that I don't understand it. I almost don't want to talk about it. I even wore an old Ferrari Sebastian Vettel hat last week, trying to give him some form of luck. Unfortunately, I don't have an Aston Martin hat, but I was trying, and it didn't work. Both the Astons on the outlap from the garage to start the race had brake issues. Lance's were on fire, so were Seb's. He ends up getting a penalty because he doesn't have the tires on 5 minutes before the race, which was a rule I'd never heard of. And it doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, look at a pit stop. It takes 1.5 seconds to put a tire on. What's the difference if they put it on 3 minutes before the race, 4 minutes? What's the difference? I mean, do we really... In this instance, can't there just be some common sense? Can't there just be some common sense? I mean, I know there's a rule about getting people off of the grid before the race. There's a certain time, et cetera, et cetera. Great. But we're dealing with a safety issue here. We're talking about brakes. We're talking about wet conditions. And they're just ensuring that the car is going to be safe for these guys. I think it was a stupid penalty. I don't know what else to say about it. It was great to see Sebastian mixing it up with Fernando. He obviously hasn't lost any skill, but he also doesn't have any luck. And he's been outperformed by Lance Stroll 2 races in a row. Sadly, in a race full of attrition, Sebastian only managed to finish 15th, 2 positions higher than he qualified. And I would have to rate Sebastian Vettel's performance this weekend as 5 out of 10. Qualifying in 12th position is George Russell. I'm really looking forward to discussing George's race in detail at the end of my race summary, but I will say that qualifying in P12 and once again out-qualifying his teammate, I believe he's undefeated in that department. Very encouraging pace by the Williams. And you know what? It goes right along with what George said in the preseason, where he thought the Williams would be fast at certain circuits, maybe not so in others, but this was one of them. And man, George has got some pace. He's got some pace, and he is certainly one of the brightest stars on today's Formula One grid. He ended up DNFing, obviously, after his incident with Bottas. And like I said, I'll discuss George's race more in depth at the end. And until then, I rate George's performance as an 8 out of 10. Qualifying in 11th position was Carlos Sainz for Scuderia Ferrari. Carlos, just like everybody else who has switched teams this season, struggled in the difficult conditions in a new car. Not surprising, especially since the field was pretty close, right? You're getting up here to the top of the grid. The margins between the drivers was very, very small. And every time I looked up, it seemed like Carlos was off the circuit. He's off driving around in the dirt. He was off driving around over the curbs. And yet, you look at his position, and he continued to improve. There's no question Carlos had pace. He had pace, but he's in a strange car in very, very difficult conditions, and he was making mistakes. He's just trying hard, and that's okay. Carlos doesn't need to prove anything to me. He doesn't need to prove anything to anybody. Every time I looked up, P8, P7, P6, I'm like, this is incredible. 2 minutes ago, he was off the circuit. So I'm okay with it. I'm okay with Carlos pushing the envelope. I'm okay with him trying his hardest because you know what? He actually moved up the grid and didn't crash. Remarkably, he ended up finishing in P5. I mean, he gained 6 positions and went off-roading for half a dozen times. I'm going to rate Carlos's race quite high. I'm giving Carlos 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in P10 was Lance Stroll. This is the second race now that Lance has out-qualified his teammate Sebastian Vettel. And like Seb, before the race, he had come through the pits and his brakes were on fire. And it certainly compromised the beginning of his race. Despite those issues, Lance once again was proving that he is actually a wet weather specialist and had a great race start in a race that was occurring in terrible conditions. He managed to work his way up to 7th and was comfortably ahead of Valtteri Bottas. In fact, while the conditions remained wet, he was pulling away from Valtteri Bottas, and we know that the Aston is struggling for grip. I think that just speaks incredibly well for Lance's skill. Despite a minor bump when visibility was absolutely zero with Lando, Lance's only issue for the race was when he went to pass Pierre Gasly, who was on the wrong tires. He went a little bit too deep. He went through the corner, but rejoined the circuit still ahead of Pierre. Now, the team didn't reach out to him and tell him to give the position back immediately, and the FIA did not direct the team for him to do so either. It wasn't until after the race that he was given a penalty. I mean, we saw last race in Bahrain, as soon as Max passed Lewis off track, he was immediately told to give the position back. That didn't happen in this case. Why? Maybe Seb was telling the truth. Maybe they were having troubles with the coffee machine. But I think assessing a penalty to Lance Stroll long after the incident happened, when all they had to do was ask him to get the position back, he would have. Pierre was so slow at that point because the team had him on the wrong tires. This was an easy pass. I have problems with this one. I do have problems with this one, and I understand why people are frustrated with the FIA. But having said that, at the end of the day, the results are the results. Stroll, who was in P7, got a penalty and ended up finishing in P8. He managed to collect a few more points for Aston Martin during their difficult time right now, and according to lap deltas, was 0.3 a lap, on average, faster than Vettel. I think Lance had a great weekend and continues to build upon his reputation, and I would rate Lance Stroll's performance as 7 out of 10. Qualifying in 9th place was Esteban Ocon. Well done, Esteban. 6 places higher than Fernando Alonso. That's making a statement. It's performances like this that I'm looking for from the guys that I've put on the 2021 hot seat, and Esteban was one of those people. Sadly, his great performance in qualifying was hurt when he was put on the wrong tires to start the race and had to pit early. He managed to drive a clean race and got it back up to P10, and was awarded P9 after Kimi Raikkonen's penalty. After watching the Alpines in Bahrain, I certainly wasn't expecting both cars to finish in the points in Imola. But this was a great drive by Esteban. These are the type of performances that Esteban needs to put together this season if he wants to have a chance at a seat at Mercedes in 2022, as if Valtteri already didn't have enough pressure on him. Great drive, Esteban, and I rate your drive this weekend as 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in P8 was Valtteri Bottas. Wow. Valtteri Bottas, P8. I mean, we all know that Lewis put a pretty miraculous lap together to get pole, but you certainly wouldn't expect the sister car to be in P8. Just like Russell, I will be discussing Bottas's race in an extra segment after I cover the Imola race recap here. One thing is certain, though. Bottas starting in P8 was only going backwards in wet conditions. And I truly believe that despite what's being said in the news, Bottas's performance in Imola only increases the temperature of the hot seat he's sitting on and seriously jeopardizes his place at Mercedes in 2022. Qualifying in 7th position was Lando Norris. Oh, Lando. The whole F1 community our hearts bled for you. Lando actually put the car P3 after qualifying, but it did exceed track limits and had his final qualifying lap negated. He took it awfully hard and apologized to the team. Later that evening, he received an encouraging message on social media from Sir Lewis Hamilton, and he obviously took it to heart because Lando certainly showed up on race day. Despite early contact in the race with Lance Stroll, when visibility was absolutely zero, Lando continued to move his way up through the field and was showing incredible pace despite the circumstances. His pace was so good, the team actually asked Daniel Ricciardo to let him by. In my 2021 predictions podcast, I had predicted that Daniel would get the better of Lando this year. Daniel is still obviously struggling getting acclimated to the car, and Lando is certainly making the most of this time by putting his stamp on this team as the number 1 driver. Zach Brown went out of his way after the race to praise the young driver and say that he's definitely made a huge step this year in becoming the driver that they all anticipate he will be. Lando kept his nose clean and continued to move up the field, and on the restart, he overtook Charles Leclerc. He continued to drive very solidly, and it wasn't until lap 60 that he was overtaken by Sir Lewis for 2nd place. He held on to P3, and he got his 2nd podium of his career. He must be delighted, as well as McLaren. Fantastic drive, Lando, and I rate your performance this weekend as a 9 out of 10. Qualifying in P6 was Daniel Ricciardo. Daniel has openly admitted that he's still trying to acclimate himself to the car. And even made mention of the fact that old habits with the old car are still lingering while driving the McLaren. Now, if we remember, Daniel took a few races to get up to speed with Renault, and it seems like that's the same way it's going at McLaren. And as we see with the other drivers who have changed to new teams this year, that's to be expected. Daniel struggled early on in the wet, and no doubt still isn't comfortable with the McLaren braking system. He was finding some pace, but when he did, he was overheating the front right tire. And that was when the team said to him, Daniel, we've given you enough time. It's time to let Lando go. And you know what? Daniel did. Kudos. He didn't drive with an ego. He's thinking long term. And this is respect. This is respect shown between two teammates, and this is fantastic for McLaren going forward. As the race wore on, he did end up losing out to the Ferraris. But overall, Daniel, a very respectful drive. And I would rate your performance this weekend a 7 out of 10. I don't recall hearing that McLaren is bringing any upgrades to the car anytime soon. But boy, wouldn't it be nice for McLaren to find just a little bit more pace? It's so great to have Red Bull up there with Mercedes right now, and I would certainly love to have McLaren join them. They're not far off. They're really not that far off. And as soon as Daniel finds his footing, Red Bull and Mercedes better keep an eye out, because McLaren are on their heels. And this is great for the fans, it's great for the sport, it's great for F1. No doubt, exciting times in the McLaren garage. Qualifying in 5th position was Pierre Gasly. As some of you may have heard in my previous podcasts, I am predicting P4 for AlphaTauri in this year's Constructors' Championship, and I'm expecting a lot out of Pierre Gasly. Unfortunately, this is the second race in a row where I think Pierre Gasly is the biggest disappointment for me for the race. After a very strong performance once again in qualifying, the team chose to start the car on wet tires, and this proved to be their downfall. Despite a good start when the track was soaking wet, the wets soon were not the tire to be on as the track dried out, and Pierre painfully fell backwards throughout the order. The team finally brought him in on lap 15 to change for inters, but by this time, the race was through. Running as low as P15, he did manage to work his way through the field with a heroic drive. But it wasn't enough to overcome the poor tire choice at the beginning of the race, and he finished in P7. Still valuable points for the team, considering that Tsunoda was not in the points, especially after he exceeded track limits and received a penalty. But poor Pierre, I think he's deserved more, and so far, race results haven't come, but they will. So keep your chin up. I would rate Pierre Gasly's performance this weekend as 7.5 out of 10. Qualifying in P4 was Charles Leclerc. I must say, this is starting to look like the pick that I got completely wrong at the beginning of the season. Ferrari have really come back to the party. And Charles, as per usual, got the very most out of the car. Now, Ferrari were anticipating a wet race and chose to go with a higher downforce setting. This worked really well at the beginning of the race, not so much at the end. Despite running well, I didn't really see much of Leclerc during the race. It wasn't until the restart where Max had a little bit of a bumble and went up onto the curb that I actually thought that Leclerc had missed out on a bit of an opportunity. As I've already mentioned earlier in the podcast, as early as the formation laps, it was a little bit confusing as to what the drivers were allowed to do if they happened to get off the track. Were they allowed to rejoin in the original position they were in? Or did they have to fall into line in the position that they rejoined the track in? One thing I noticed on the replay was that Charles noticeably backed off when Max got into a little bit of trouble. Well, unfortunately, we don't live in hindsight, but I think that Leclerc was actually allowed to pass Max there. And that would have been very interesting, wouldn't it? After such a dismal year last year, to have Charles in the Ferrari leading in Italy, hoo-wee, that would have been interesting. It certainly would have been a great morale boost for the team, but I don't think that Charles had the overall pace to hold that position until the end of the race. But nevertheless, Ferrari P4, P5, fantastic. And the word is they're going to keep developing this car throughout the rest of the season. So as I mentioned before, it's already great to have Mercedes and Red Bull at the top of the timesheets, with McLaren close on their heels. Can you imagine if Ferrari managed to close the gap as well? Why do they have to change the regulations? Why? This is such good racing right now, and it's only going to get better as the year progresses. Oh, you know what? I've never even been a Ferrari fan. Well, I haven't been a Ferrari fan since 1982, but I'm really happy for them. I'm happy for them. I'm happy for their drivers and all their supporters. I mean, Ferrari is Formula One. So massive congratulations to Charles for P4, and I rate his driving performance on the weekend a 9 out of 10. Qualifying in 3rd position was Max Verstappen. To say that this was a surprise is probably an understatement. The consensus going into Imola was that Max and Red Bull were the favorites to not only secure the pole, but to win the race. During Q3, he seemed to put together one or two fast sectors on a lap, but couldn't put the entire lap together. And it was these small errors that relegated him to the second row on the grid. Come race day, though, it's fair to say Max was firing on all cylinders. And I love the fact that he started the race in wet conditions in second gear. This reduced the torque off of the line and certainly reduced the chance of wheel spin, and he got the jump on Lewis. He moved left and quickly found himself side by side with Lewis going through the kink, headed down to turn 1. For a short time, Lewis was in the middle of a Red Bull sandwich. Now, turn 1 at Imola is actually very similar to turn 1 at Monza, except it just turns in the opposite direction. But rarely do you see two cars going side by side through it. Max had the advantage of being on the racing line and ran Lewis wide. Now, I must admit, I'm not really a fan of the modern style of overtaking where people can take the racing line and simply run somebody else out of road. But now, a few days after the race, perhaps my age is getting the best of me. Because simply, there's no way that two modern Formula One cars could go through turn 1 together, racing for the lead in those conditions without incident. Max quickly built up a 5-second advantage and was in total control of the early stages of the race. This was a combination of a few things. A, driving at the front and having a clear view. B, he had the high rake, more grip, and more temperature in his tires. And C, Lewis lost an end plate going over the curbing in turn 1. No doubt he lost some downforce as well. And thus, he lost pace. It wasn't until Lewis was finally able to build up some temperatures in his tires that he was able to claw some of that lead back, and the gap was down to 2.5 seconds. Max continued to drive faultlessly, and the track was starting to dry out, and by mid-distance, he was lapping Valtteri Bottas. Then, on lap 32, Max was given a gift. Lewis went off track, lapping back markers including George Russell, and found himself nose first in the wall. And shortly thereafter, Bottas and Russell came together, causing a red flag. Once the race got going again, Max found himself behind the safety car, and lost it. It was his only real mistake of the race. He climbed up on the curbing, the car went left, car went right, but he managed to get it back on the road safely without damaging it. And as I mentioned before, was a little bit fortunate that a few cars didn't actually overtake him during this moment. But to win, you not only have to be good, you have to be lucky. And on this day, no doubt, Max was both. He cruised home to a brilliant victory. It was brilliant for Red Bull, it was brilliant for Max, it was brilliant for F1 and all of us. He is now positioned only 1 point behind Lewis in the Drivers' Championship. The battle is officially on, and I know that all of us can't wait till the next time that these two drivers line up side by side in the next race. In my preseason prediction podcast, I predicted that Max Verstappen would be the world champion this year, and make no doubt about it, Max's drive in Imola was the drive of a future world champion. Now, whether that happens this year or not remains to be seen, but it certainly looks like Red Bull and Max are up to the task in 2021. Congratulations on a great win, Max. Congratulations, Red Bull. Max, you've earned a driver rating this weekend of 10 out of 10. Qualifying in second position was Sergio Perez. This was Sergio's first time qualifying on the front row. That's actually a fact I wasn't aware of. And going into Sunday, I had high hopes that he might possibly score another victory. Alas, that didn't happen. And much like the other drivers that I've mentioned who've had difficulty adjusting to the new car this year that they're driving, Sergio continued to misjudge his grip, misjudge his braking points, and I lost count. How many times was Sergio off track? 6? 7 times? You add that to a 10-second pit stop that he had, and things just were going from bad to worse. Now, he did say after preseason testing that he figured it would take 4 or 5 races for him to get up to speed, driving the Red Bull. Well, 2 down, 3 to go. But this just also serves as a clear indication that Red Bull is difficult to drive. That Red Bull has been designed and engineered around the driving style of Max Verstappen, and Sergio's having to adapt. And much like Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon before him, he's struggling. Hopefully, Dr. Helmut Marko keeps his nose out of it and allows Sergio the 3 or 4 more races that he requires to get fully comfortable with that car. P11 was the best that he could do, and unfortunately for Sergio, I rate his performance this weekend as a 4 out of 10. Qualifying on pole, his 99th of his career, Sir Lewis Hamilton. If you watched qualifying and heard the in-car radio, this pole position was actually a surprise to not only Sir Lewis, but also to Bono, and they had a good laugh about it. Now, the big concern going into the race especially if it was starting under dry conditions, were that the Red Bulls would be on the soft tire and Lewis was on the medium. This, of course, was negated by the wet weather start, and all the front runners started on inters. Now, I know it was mentioned that Max started off in second gear, and I did hear that others did the same thing. I did not hear that about Lewis. Regardless, Max beat Lewis off the line and quickly found himself alongside him and beat him down to turn 1. Imola has not been known as a track that's been easy to pass on. All we have to do is look back in history and remember the classic race between Fernando Alonso and Michael Schumacher, when Alonso was able to hold off Schumacher in the closing laps, despite the fact he had the engine turned down. The advantage leading out of turn 1 was on everybody's mind, and it certainly led Lewis to hang in there as long as he could. After having looked at the incident a few times, there's no question that Lewis did outbrake Max, but that left Lewis in a situation where he was actually traveling a little bit too fast. And had Lewis been by himself, I don't even know if he would have been able to make the corner. Thanks to Max, we'll never know. But Lewis did go wide, ran over the curbs, and damaged his front wing, losing one of his end plates. Due to the Mercedes' lower rake than the Red Bull, it took Lewis a few more laps to get his tires up to temperature. And as soon as he did, he started clawing back into the lead. It wasn't until lap 32, when an uncharacteristic error found Lewis going off the track. He was in the process of lapping George Russell, who had moved all the way over to the right-hand side of the track, which was also the dry line. Lewis, now on the wet line, and now in a sharper angle to make the left-hand turn, misjudged everything and found himself in the gravel. In an attempt to turn the car, Lewis blipped the throttle, but instead he just spun the tires and the car went straight and the nose hit the wall. I initially questioned whether or not Mercedes would choose to change that front wing after the turn 1 incident where he lost the end plate. Now, that question was no longer in doubt. Lewis kept his cool and kept the car running and found reverse. Brilliantly, he chose to stay in reverse, and now the Mercedes was acting like a front-wheel drive as it navigated its way through the gravel trap back to the track. Moments later, the second disaster for Mercedes, as Valtteri Bottas and George Russell came together on the DRS straight, causing the red flag. Now, the rules during a red flag say that you can actually make repairs to the car, so the change of the wing didn't cost them any extra time. Like I mentioned before with Max, in order to be successful sometimes in sport, you not only have to be good, you have to be lucky, and Lewis was both. He was even able to unlap himself, and after the restart, the track was drying out quickly, and the low-rake Mercedes quickly found its pace. Lewis quickly managed to make his way through the field. He managed to get past Ricardo, Sainz, Leclerc, and Norris before the end of the race, and also posted the fastest lap with 3 laps to go. The point that he earned for fastest lap is all that stands between him and Max in the Drivers' Championship. And considering how close these two are evenly matched, every point counts, and may end up being the deciding factor come the end of the season as to who wins the World Championship. Make no mistake about it, this was an epic drive, and the only difference between Max and Lewis is this wasn't the drive of a future world champion. This was the drive of a 7-time world champion. I think Toto Wolff said it best. Lewis Hamilton saved the day for Mercedes, yet again. And therefore, I give Lewis Hamilton a 9.5 rating for Imola. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. My name is Matthew Kane, and stay tuned for part 2 when I offer an in-depth analysis of the incident between George Russell and Valtteri Bottas. And before I leave you, I'll leave you a little teaser of that episode. Until next time, take care, everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.
Currently losing a lot of time behind Stroll.
Come on, Valtteri.